Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We're getting there. It's morning sometime. We do have an international audience, so it is morning. Some of our friends in Australia and places like that. So welcome to episode 206 of Into the Outer Realms. I would uh, call this a classic episode, a core subject matter for us. You've been listening to Tanya and I for over 4 years on this show, on many other shows, talking about our own experiences, our own missing time, Tanya's experimentation, the psychological tests that were done on me. All that stuff. So we're not going to spend any of time on it. But like so many experiencers, questions come up, hard questions. Why me? What do they want? Are they dangerous? That's a big thing now. On one hand, in the disclosure movement, we say that the Defense Department is creating this fear agenda because it's good for their coffers and especially for the defense contractors. But on the other hand, to say that they're all benevolent and they're all wonderful and they don't mean us any harm. There are so many races and species out there, some over 200, 260, 280, I believe, have been encountered by humans on or around Earth. So that's a lot. That's a lot of species. So we have a wonderful guest tonight. He has the distinction of being the only credentialed man of science to have come forward as an experiencer. So his book, and I apologize, you'll see when the banner comes up, he's gone with a new cover for this, but this is what I got as my review copy. A Scientist's Own Alien Abduction Encounters. It was fascinating. Of course, I have this huge library behind me here filled with books about this subject. We've had Pam Nance on the show. We've had Wes Roberts on the show twice. Michael Giannetti is a very close friend of the show. Very compelling experiences. 4 times we've had Reverend Michael Carter on the show. He's had visitations by 3 or 4 of these different species. So it's a subject very near and dear to my heart. So I want to give Dr. Rapuano plenty of time to talk this evening. As always, we'll go about an hour and 5 minutes or so. Your questions are welcome. He loves that part of the experience. So don't be shy about asking him questions. As always, I know that our audience is super respectful, super into this, and many of you are indeed, like us, experiencers. So let's roll the opening. As I say, welcome, sit back, and you're in for a wonderful, wonderful hour.
There exists a realm beyond our wildest dreams, a realm beyond reality that the gatekeepers and guardians have always told us consists of nothing but tricks of the eye, weather balloons, swamp gas, sand cranes, fairy tale myths of monsters, crackpot conspiracy theories, and desperate cries for attention.
We know this realm exists, and it's just beyond the horizon. The preset path, the well-worn walkways where the cynics want us to stay.
Instead, give this a listen. Put on your headphones, adjust your volume, close your eyes, and fasten your mental seatbelts because the twilight-tinged turnoff from reality's alluring highway is looming just ahead.
We're about to leave the plane of the easily explained, couldn't possibly be's, and the no way I just saw what I saw's, for the spaces and places where everything is possible, and if you stay long enough, even probable. We're about to take a journey into the outer realms.
Dr. Bruce E. Rapuano has a BA degree from the University of Pennsylvania, where he majored in neurobiology and minored in psychology, a PhD in neuropharmacology, and from the neuropharmacology, from the University of Connecticut, and a JD from New York Law School. He has conducted independent biomedical research as a cell biologist at internationally recognized medical institutions, including the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center and the Hospital for Special Surgery, both located in New York City. Dr. Rapuano has authored or co-authored 30 scientific articles in peer-reviewed medical journals. He has published articles on topics such as the role of membrane phospholipids in nerve function, the skeletal effects of cancer metastases, metabolic bone diseases, and the coordinate surface electrical and biological properties of titanium alloy implant materials. Dr. Rapuano has also worked concurrently as a medical research scientist and associate radiation safety officer at the Hospital for Special Surgery. He currently lives in Manhattan with his wife, who is a physician. Dr. Rapuano, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's great to finally meet you, Joey, and be on the into the outer realms with you.
Thank you. I certainly appreciate it.
Thank you.
So, and this was one of these situations where you sought me out. So, folks, if you know people with a story to tell, please have them contact me. I love that. That's wonderful. It's one thing to chase down guests, which luckily I never have to do, but it was wonderful. So thank you again, as I said in the green for reaching out. So I really have to say, having read dozens of these first-person accounts and being experienced in myself, that this is truly one of the most compelling, convincing narratives of ET abduction that I have ever read. And although there are increasing numbers of medical professionals, and going all the way back to Dr. Mack, who have come forward, Dr. Mack, correct me if I'm wrong, was not an experiencer, but did exhaustive tests and designed questionnaires and all, got a great deal of pushback. And that was many decades ago. Now, some neuroscientists, some psychiatrists, psychologists are looking at near-death experiences. That seems to be the starter kit for the medical industry to look seriously. You know, it's not oxygen deprivation that's making lights. And but you told me that you are the only credentialed man of science to have come forward after all this time with your experiences. That's amazing. What compelled you to do it, to come forward?
You know, I going back as far as the 1980s, you know, I'd had all these experiences, these strange experiences I couldn't explain all my life. And you know, when you have experiences that make such a strong impression, you can remember every detail. It's amazing how the memories last over years and decades. But then the 80s came, and we had these great UFO alien abduction investigators, Dr. John Mack, you just mentioned, Dr. David Jacobs, and of course the groundbreaking Bud Hopkins write these books. And I was simply floored. I in looking at what they were reporting on, which amounted to accounts of, well, more than hundreds, almost thousands of purported alien abductees. When I looked at what I called the core alien abduction experience or scenario, I literally could check every box in that scenario. And I came to the conclusion near the end of the 80s, and this also was a time when Whitley Strieber published his first book, Communion. Yeah. You know, I really, in checking every single box in this alien abduction scenario, I can only come to one conclusion, that it had happened to me as well. Not only did I believe in the phenomenon, because the books that came out in that time period and during that decade were so compelling and so convincing that I not only did I believe the accounts of the witnesses that were whose experiences were written about, I also thought I had the same experiences. And then, you know, I'd seen a YouTube of a very experienced alien abduction investigator, and he looked so serious, so somber, and so utterly convinced that this had happened. This had happened to the human race, that we're being visited by some extraterrestrial or alien or interdimensional species that's interacting with human beings, and performing experiments on them. And I thought to myself, he reminded me of Bud Hopkins, the statement Bud Hopkins had made 20 or 30 years before that he no longer had the luxury of believing that he was wrong.
Mm.
Thought, back in the 80s, I couldn't really come forward and tell my story because I was at the very beginning of my career as a biomedical research scientist, and knew it would really threaten my ability to continue in that capacity. But I thought, I'm more established now. The phenomenon is real. I know it's been real. I've known this for decades. And we're in the middle of what we hope to be a disclosure movement that will put enough pressure on the government to come forward and tell us what they know. And that's why I thought now is the best time for me and best time for the disclosure movement to come forward with a very unique story that, as you pointed out, has never been told before by a mainstream science, not only American scientist, but a scientist of any kind. In a nutshell, that's why I decided to write the book.
Right. There you go. So there's a larger version because what I read is the abridged. So tell us about the process.
I was struck in going back and looking at the abduction literature again, thinking about my own experiences in planning the writing of this book. I was struck by how much control the aliens, in my experiences, were able to exert over me, and how much they were able to exert over other abductees in terms of rendering them unconscious, erasing their memory, implanting false memories, paralyzing or turning off witnesses that were in the vicinity of the abduction. That I began to think of the mechanism. What is the technological mechanism or biological mechanism that would enable them to be able to exert such control over human beings? And I theorized that perhaps some type of technology was assisting in this particular capability. Not only that, from the age of 6 years old, along with all the memories I had of seeing strange UFOs, close encounters with small 3.5 to 4 foot tall humanoid beings, I had this one memory that never went away of it looked like I would say a BB with studded projections around it, maybe 2 millimeters in diameter, that I understood had been inside my nasal cavity. I didn't know if it was still there, but I had a memory that I would get in trouble if it ever came out. Now, to have this kind of a memory of a device, what I thought was the device, and the emotional context convinced me that it was real. And then fast forward to the late 70s, I think early 80s, and I read Raymond Fowler's The Andreasen Affair. And sure enough, Betty Andreasen reports being on a table with a gray alien administering some type of medical procedure where a probe is inserted into her nasal cavity, and when it's withdrawn, she sees exactly the type of what I call a device that I had a memory of from 1961. And her experience, I think, was from 1967. So I really became convinced that I really should describe, well, first of all, research the type of experiment. I won't call this an experiment, but the type of technology that the aliens had developed to be able to use such a device, which I theorize was a brain implant interface that would be placed near the nasal cavity, perhaps into the brain via that route, and then tried to explain in the book how that would work, how it might be used to maybe download human memories or catalog human mental activity, with the initial goal of trying to understand how the human mind works. But as I deal with in the larger book, the unabridged book, the other goal, which I have suggested, and I hope this is not what's going on, But the other goal would be of trying to understand the human mind with the purpose of controlling it and manipulating human consciousness in order to control us and the species. And that's why in the unabridged version, I dealt with a lot of the technologies that companies like Neuralink, Elon Musk company, that developing brain-computer interfaces to help paraplegics and restore function to people that are paralyzed, and that might enable them to move artificial limbs if they have some degree of disability, and how an alien implant, maybe with extrapolating from the technology that humans are working on currently, but extrapolating from that and trying to describe how an alien implant might work to do the things I just described in terms of understanding how the mind works and being able to control it. And as I describe in the larger book, being able to, as I would imagine, play the human mind like a piano, which I would not be too surprising if alien technology would be advanced enough to be able to develop a device to do this. Right. And that's described in several chapters in the larger unabridged version.
Yeah. Well, that's what they did to me. They tried to convince me that what I was seeing was real. It obviously wasn't real. It didn't make sense. And then one extremely compelling thing that happened was there was a gas station, and the gas station was a point of interest, contention, so on and so forth, as more and more researchers began to look at our case, because the gas station simply didn't exist. Well, when I was in middle school, and I was, let me see, it was 2019 at the time, so I was 41 years old when Tanya and I had the experience. When I was in middle school, I desperately wanted to have my own garage. I want to be an auto mechanic. I loved cars. I loved working with my dad on cars, and they talked me out of it. Like, oh, your scores are too high. You gotta go to college. This is for, and they pulled that out of my memory. They made the car look transparent so that I would watch the mechanics of the car. And I believe it was Jacques Vallée was involved in a case in Argentina where he brought up this idea that somehow they go into your mind and they take these memories that they can build narratives around for their tests.
One of the chapters in the unabridged book discusses how human scientists are performing analogous experiments on rodents, on mice and rats, that can actually implant memories. That the rats respond in a certain way to their environment when they've never experienced the cue or stimulus that would cause them to respond that way. It's almost like a Pavlovian conditioning that is implanted into the brain by direct brain stimulation with an implant that has really been shown to do remarkable things. And so I explain how this type of direct brain stimulation using an implanted device could account for why during the missing time part of the alien abduction experience, so much of the experience is never recalled, is gone seemingly forever, unless it could be retrieved through regressive hypnosis. And at other times, memories can be implanted to cover up that there was an abduction. If there was a UFO close encounter that preceded the abduction, sometimes that sighting is covered up with the sighting of a more conventional aircraft, a helicopter, an airplane or jet. So these capabilities are very easy to imagine, because they represent simple extrapolation from what human scientists are currently doing.
Right.
So I think it's frankly would be easy for them.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was my experience. So there's one more question I want to ask you before we get into some of your childhood experiences. And I'm going to use some questions from the audience to set it up. So bear with me here. question: as a medical scientist, how should we study this phenomenon? How has it changed over the years? Now, you studied neurobiology, psychology. Can you define neuropharmacology, please?
Neuropharmacology is the study of the effect of drugs on the brain.
Ah, okay. So you have that, um, but then you get the law degree. How does that figure in?
I had a lot of lawyers in my family, and I always
Oh,
admired them. They were my role models. I always wondered, should I become a lawyer? And I like the legal mind, I like the way lawyers think, very logical, but yet very analytical, like scientists. So that was, I completed a law school education, not with any intent to practice law, which I never have. Because frankly, when I finished law school, as exhilarating as the experience was, my passion was in scientific research. So I
right,
remained a scientist after that.
right. But to go back to that, I would think, and I made an assumption in my book review, uh, that lawyers build their cases using prior cases. So it seems you've used all the skills that
Yes.
you've earned over the years in this work.
My wife has said I went through all my levels of training because the aliens wanted me to write this book. That was the
Yeah,
idea she had.
yeah,
She's being facetious, but I think some that would resonate with a lot of investigators. That idea, that theory.
yeah.
But certainly, always wondered, and I've said this to other investigators that why did I become interested in the brain, in neurobiology? I remember within a year or two of a very unusual abduction experience, I became interested in extrasensory perception. I was even asked by my teacher to talk to our class about it, and I can't rule out that I went into this field in terms of wanting to study neurobiology in college and then graduate school because of the paranormal or alien abduction experiences I had in my early life.
Yeah. So let's go back now. I think I have teased the
Mhm.
audience enough. So it's June 19th. It's 1965 in New Haven, Connecticut, and you are 10 years old.
Well, we had a group of 8 children. My mother was also home at the time, so I'm going to call this a multiple witness encounter with a UFO. Probably 9 witnesses in total. But I happened to be the person that was playing defense near the end of our property, watching what was going on, and no one but me, for some reason, saw out of the corner of my eye, and it was actually on the right, um, a brilliant light in the sky, and it just looked way too large to be anything conventional. But I really couldn't get a view of it because it was obstructed by a large oak tree in the center of our front lawn of our property. So I walked toward our front door just to get a better glimpse of it, and when I looked up directly west, I was astonished. I saw what looked like the biblical star of Bethlehem,
Mhm.
almost too bright to look at. It was that intensely brilliant, but not a point source of light like that from a helicopter, airplane, jet, um, planet, or star. This was literally 2.5 times the size of the full moon. It looked like it was right over our heads. I would say at the 10 o'clock position. And at this point, people, my other classmates that were playing this game of kickball with me, which included my brother, who had not seen it before, began to be drawn to what I was looking at and came over to join me. We're looking at the object together for maybe 30 to 60 seconds. And at that point, I noticed what many investigators have termed the Oz effect, where the UFO close encounter and transitions to a, a atmosphere of strangeness where things slow down or all of the ambient noises of the neighborhood, in the surrounding neighborhood, the animals, the dogs barking, the insects. I can no longer hear the grass the grasshoppers and crickets, noise of which had been deafening before that. So startled was I by this Oz effect that I, thinking maybe I was just so immersed in this experience that I was failing to observe what was, or be aware of what was going around me. I turned my head away from the UFO, back toward the backyard of our property, just to see if I can hear any noise. Again, the ambient noises of the animals and insects did not return. Everything remained silent. Everything seemed to be slowing down to the point where I became afraid, because one of the classmates that had been standing next to me on my left appeared to be paralyzed. He was frozen, motionless, wasn't saying anything. And I knew this for a fact because I became very apprehensive. I didn't want to really deal with that. And I noticed that the rest of the group, which was on my right, he was on my left, they were on my right, also were not moving, and they were no longer talking. And this was alarming. This is very reminiscent of a lot of UFO abduction encounters where, whether it occurs at night or could be in the daytime, when a group of people are driving in an automobile and an abduction takes place, but they all report the same thing, that the witnesses, if this is a multiple witness abduction, seem to be turned off or paralyzed during the abduction event. And when the abductee is returned, again, they are quote unquote turned on again. And the other thing that happened, and I really need to mention this, is what confirms my suspicion, because this experience is consistent with many other experiences I've had during my childhood that would be consistent with the alien abduction model or scenario. But what really convinced me that this was one of those experiences was that at the point at which I saw this UFO move away, disappear over the horizon, and then walk back, one of our group had said to me, "Bruce, where did you go?" And I explained that I'd gone to our neighbor's property to get a better view as the object traveled away from us. But she said, "No, I saw you there too, but you were gone. You had disappeared." And so again, I'll leave it there, because there's a lot more that I talk about in that particular chapter. Again, this is another in what I would categorize as one of my abduction experiences that, again, are very reminiscent of what has been reported by a number of abduction investigators in many respects.
Unmute here. Okay. Thank you for that. And I was amazed that at 10 years old, you're talking about height, distance, speed, objects relative to other objects. So do you, having thought about this for so long in your life, there seems to be some merit to what your wife said, or so all these other people had a much different experience than you did. So were you predestined? Was it that they could sense that you were you selected? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I've never had any insight, any clue as to why I was one of them. Could be a number of things. It could be something as simple as, I was willing to go along with the program.
Yeah.
Perhaps they thought that I would be someone who would be maybe because of my natural childhood curiosity, would be more would gravitate toward this type of experience and not be frightened of it. And as a biomedical research scientist, I can tell you the most difficult animal experiments are the ones where the animals are reacting right in the fight or flight response, become very afraid, and I might be one in the category of the individual that would be a willing subject and a good experimental subject. Or, and other investigators have talked about this for a number of years and decades, the, about the theory that there are certain bloodlines that the alien scientists are interested in for some reason, that, whether or not there are genetic differences in the abductee population that may predispose them to having certain abilities that would allow them to be able to interact with the aliens that are visiting us, communicate with them, perhaps using telepathy, or perhaps have certain perceptual ability to be able to be aware of and interact with interdimensional beings by some process in the brains, some newly evolved organ of perception that may only be present in a small, well, may not be such a small percentage, but in a relatively small percentage of the population. So there are just a number of ideas that we can discuss that have been already discussed by other people in the field, but I still am not comfortable with any of them, and I really have to be open to every other idea that hasn't been discussed or I'm not aware of, to try to explain why people, as you say, appear to be selected for this type of what I call experimentation.
Right. Thank you.
But you may have other ideas that I haven't touched on.
Everything's tracking so much. I want to talk about some of your other things. So I'm going to gloss here just a little. But you, as a lawyer, as a scientist, you said, here's what's going on. So it's 14 months prior to your sighting. There's the Lonnie Zamora, Socorro, New Mexico. This is the time of the Condon Domini, J. Allen Hynek, Jacques Vallée. So these things are happening, and they're credible people catalog them. There's also a lot of, at the highest halls of power, there's a lot of interference being run, which tells you that there was probably something to this. It's not swamp gas. It's not Venus. It's not, certainly yours didn't sound, you weren't mistaking Venus or the North Star when you say 2.5 times the size of the moon. Then I'm like, okay, I'm with this. And then you start talking about experiences in your own home with sleep paralysis, with sleepwalking, with missing time. Do you want to give us the frequency and the circumstances of these experiences?
Well, everyone, I won't say everyone, but 20 to 30% of the population has been reported to have at least one episode of sleep paralysis. But what I had was recurrent, episodes, and many abductees have reported this, and it's in many cases, probably almost all the cases, including mine, with no known medical or psychological cause of this. I have never had any post-traumatic stress or medical cause, and I've done the research that would account for this particular type of sleep disorder, and yet, I've had experiences where I would, like a lot of other abductees, wake up paralyzed, and there'd be a strange figure in the room. Why, in so many cases, though, everyone seems to be seeing in the abductee population beings that have the same height, same disproportionately large hairless heads, white color or gray color, but the people that also report sleep paralysis end up seeing the same being, which is not really characteristic of sleep paralysis. But I had, other experiences where, I was not asleep at the time, where I had strange physical symptoms, where I would have episodes of missing time, where I would walk from one room of our apartment into another room and find my family members there, and I didn't really know what I'd been doing prior to that. And there was a thunderstorm that was rapidly approaching, and the sound of which became deafening without any lightning at all. so deafening to the point where, as a 6-year-old, I knew that was not a storm. I had become convinced at that tender age that there was some type of machine or flying machine above the house causing this particular sound. And again, associated with missing time, another evidence of missing time where I was not asleep, where again I could not. I was in the apartment. I was alone. I could not fathom for the life of me what I had been doing all day, and felt wetness under each nostril. I didn't know what was going on, whether I had a cold, but a voice, which I knew was not my voice, was in my head telling me, "Don't let them see the blood." Now that's alerting me, number one, to the fact that I'm bleeding, which I didn't know at the time, and issuing a command how to respond to that. And I walked several steps to the bathroom and was horrified to see that I was in fact bleeding from both nostrils. And several seconds later, my family members came into the apartment. So it was almost as if I'd had, some type of medical intervention causing trauma inside my nasal cavity. And I was being told not to let anyone know about this. Again, not at all associated with sleep paralysis. This was in the middle of the day. So these are some of the experiences I've had where, I've had evidence of physical, I call a medical or experimental procedure formed on me, which would be consistent with the insertion of a nasal implant. And one example of what I call a telepathic communication with, I expect to be none other than the individuals that were responsible for giving me the implant, which again has been reported about numerous times in the abduction literature, as you know. And I've had other experiences where I would wake up and again hear a voice telling me, "Don't be afraid, go back to sleep." But again, I couldn't move. So, again, everything I've had is part of this, what I call core abduction scenario, that has been replicated so many times in the UFO abduction literature.
It's sinister to me, this push-pull of the benevolent malevolent, right? Betty Hill talks about it, other people talk about it, where this really hurts. What you're doing to me really hurts. And while the worker drones are sort of doing their thing, this other being comes, a Nordic type or a Pleiadian, something like that, and sort of calms the situation, says, "Just breathe, everything's fine, you're going to be okay." But it almost feels like childhood sexual trauma, which is rough because that's the big criticism of regression hypnosis. I went through it. Tanya went through it. Lots of people have listened to the tapes. They're compelling, or a select handful of people have. They're very compelling. But it's sinister. It's hard to dismiss it as benevolent, because you were talking about doing experiments on animals and having that fight or flight. And I guess it was about 18 months ago, I was talking to so many colleagues about how do you say, "Oh, this is benevolent," but yet people are taken against their will, having things inserted in them, having babies possibly taken out of them, all the things you went through. And I said, well, what do we do with our pets? We spay them, we neuter them. And once the pet has gone to the vet and had that experience, you have a hard time getting them to go back in the building. It's very much Dr. Moreau's house of pain to them at that point. Do you think that metaphor bears any merit, that they could be doing this for some benevolent, benign purpose that we just can't comprehend?
It's possible. I don't have any evidence in my case that it's either benevolent or sinister, but I simply have to ask the question, from the discussions of alien human hybrids, and I call them alien human transgenic beings. So they look like us, they're human beings, but they have probably non-human genes or DNA sequences that may represent mutations, alterations in pre-existing genes, and maybe alien DNA sequences. But these are individuals that were genetically altered. For what purpose? I would, as an optimist, as I mentioned before, I would like to think it's being done for as a necessary step in our accelerated evolution, so that we can get along with the cosmic or intergalactic community by first being able to get along with each other. And that may be, as I say, necessary for our evolution, that we need to have a more advanced species, especially at this critical juncture in human history, when we need to have this push, this acceleration. I'd like to think that's what the reason is, but I look at the work of one or two investigators that report that the abductees are told there's going to be a change in the hierarchy on our planet, and abductees and transgenic humans, as I call them, are going to be participating in some type of transition to, lack of a better expression, new world order. So that's a possible scenario. That's a possibility that that's not pleasant to contemplate. And so this is what some of the abductees are claiming has been communicated to them. So I can't. This represents evidence that I find it impossible to ignore. It's not conclusive, but it does raise the specter that nothing about this is benevolence. It's all about control for the purpose of having dominion over the planet and its resources and our species, that perhaps might be relegated to, like the Greys are, in my view, servants to this hyper advanced master species from wherever.
Right. There you go. I'd like to talk about some of these larger topics, but on page 136 of the edition that I have, you rise up out of your bed and go on a journey. Could you talk about that? It's very compelling.
Never had anything like this experience. I've never talked to anyone who has had anything like this experience or read about such an experience. But I must have been pubescent, prepubescent, 11, 12, 13, right in that range. I'm not really sure. But it just, for some reason, woke up, sat up in an instant, as if I'd been, my torso had been pulled up out of the bed like a like a puppeteer would activate a puppet, and I felt electricity through my body. I felt instantly completely awake and alert, which is difficult to explain neurophysiologically, and had an idea in my mind as well that something was going to happen. So I felt altered state of consciousness. It was almost like a lucid dream. In other words, it was hyper alert, but I knew I was awake. This is not a dream. And again, as I say, this sense of electricity flowing through my body, and the excitement psychologically that I was about to make contact with something transcendent. I had no idea. It would not have occurred to me it was going to be an intelligence alien to this planet. It could have been a dead relative. It could have been, but something transcended to normal human experience. And I had to move, or I was going to miss the opportunity. So I didn't even bother getting my slippers. This was probably well after midnight. The rest of my family members were completely asleep. And I got up out of bed, walked out of my bedroom, down the stairs, and realized how strange the experience this was, knowing that I had to try to do some reality testing to separate it from what was a dream or a walking dream, and what I convinced, but I needed to prove it to myself, was actually happening to me in physical reality. So I would, make note of whatever I touched, how cold the doorknob was in the front door as I opened it up to exit the house, and the noises in the neighborhood, whether there were any cars passing by, whether there were any clothes on the clothesline of our neighbor across the street. I became aware of all these things because it just seemed such a crazy adventure or pseudo venture I was embarking upon. I wanted to convince myself that this was really happening, and I walked, must have been across the street, across one or two neighbors' properties for about 100 yards, and for some reason I stopped. I don't know how I knew that I wasn't supposed to walk any farther. Strangely enough, I had reached a clearing. This was the largest clearing, perfectly manicured lawn that was, we lived in a very heavily wooded neighborhood, but this was the only large clearing that would have been perfect for a UFO to land. And strangely enough, this was the exact area over which we'd seen the UFO, the Star of Bethlehem configuration UFO 2 or 3 years before. It would have been right overhead. At this point, I don't know what's going to happen. I have no clue. I can't even imagine what's going to happen. But I look up to my left and I see a bright light in the sky. And now I'm not experiencing any transition to this Oz effect, but I'm experiencing now an altered state of my physicality and an altered state of consciousness. I think I prefer to stop there. I mean, you can ask any questions or make any comments, because I don't really want to kind of spoil it for anyone who wants to read the book. I've lost the audio now. I've lost the audio.
I'm a little under the weather, and I muted the mic
okay. Okay, there
to
you
not
are.
be coughing
Yeah.
at all. Thank you.
You scared me.
No, I was so drawn in, as I was when I read the book, and when I wrote the book review. I said, well, I'm stopping here early out. You all need to read the book, so thank you for that. So
can I make an aside, if you don't mind?
Yeah, please do.
Keep that thought. Please don't lose that thought. But I really said something that was a little bit misleading. I did have one account in the book of someone who had very similar experience, where at the age of 25, again, for some reason, just woke up and in his pajamas like me, walked down to the backyard, and then regressive hypnosis then revealed that he had an encounter with the Greys, was taken to a clearing very close to where in which a UFO had landed, and then underwent the same type of abduction experience I had. And I'll let the reader discover that both of us had the same type of procedure done by this same species.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm
And
sorry.
thank you
I'm
for
sorry.
that clarification.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, that's perfect. I appreciate that. And so that takes us to these nasal implants and extractions. Of course, the work of Dr. Roger Leir. I just want to get something out of the way before we go to where I want to go to next. Dr. Leir, especially at the end of his life, said, "I don't believe these are tracking devices." What is your position on the purpose of these devices?
Oh, but I've already described the nasal implant purpose. That I really believe they're brain-machine interfaces that are used to communicate with a, let's say, remote AI computer. Right. That the implant is transmitting magnetic signals from different sources of the brain of magnetic activity, that they're being sent by microwave transmission to a remote AI computer that's then decoding those signals into whatever we're seeing or experiencing or thinking at the time. And then this remote AI computer is then using this information of how to decode magnetic signals from the human brain to learn how we're thinking and to be able to see what we're experiencing and thinking and hearing simply from measuring our electromagnetic signatures for these that are emitted from different sources in the brain of whatever mental activity is we're experiencing at that time. And then knowing where those particular sources in the brain of the mental activities are through direct brain stimulation, if that capability resides in the implant, the aliens are then able to erase the memory, make us see things that aren't really there, because they know where all the brain sources are from their experimentation, which I believe has, at least that phase of their experimental study was probably concluded 2 or 3 decades ago. And now they have the capability of being able to, if they want to control us, if they want to simulate a virtual reality, or using these implants to, a la the Matrix, make us see a reality that isn't there, if that's part of their purpose. Now, Roger Lear never worked with any implants that were moved from the head, from the nasal cavity or into
Great
the eye
point.
or inside the ear canal or behind the ear. So my only idea for what those devices might be, in addition to tracking, they may be useful in eliminating the background electromagnetic interference that might prevent the nasal implant or the intrabrain implant from being able to separate the magnetic signals in the brain from surrounding electromagnetic fields from, the appliances in the home, or the transmission lines, or the automobiles or trains that are in the surrounding environment. I know that Dr. Lear has, and other investigators that have worked with him, have some evidence that there's some physical connection between these implants that are not in the head and the nervous system. He's found evidence that the implants contain neural tissue. I don't want to address that. I haven't really dealt with that issue in the book, but that is one of his hypotheses. But again, it's not something I'm going to develop here, for the purposes of our discussion.
That's perfect. Thank you. So, you spend a lot of pages and you have wonderful medical illustrations of just how complicated and potentially dangerous and or lethal these implantations and extractions are. My question is, before I move on to your grandfather and some larger implications for your family, um, to your knowledge, has anyone successfully removed one of these implants from the nasal area? I know Whitley Strieber has one behind his left ear. He's talked about it publicly. Are you aware of anyone who's been able to extract one of these nasal implants?
Well, you're familiar with the work of Daryl Sims,
Yes,
and
very much.
I'm not just referring to Daryl Sims' work, but 1 or 2 other investigators, including I believe Whitley Strieber and John Mack, if I'm not mistaken. Well, I mean, they have had abductees or experiencers that were consulting them actually bring in implants that they claim had been ejected, perhaps by a sneeze, or
Right.
or in one case, I think it was it might have been Dr. Mack's work. I'm not entirely sure about this, but the abductee claimed after regressive hypnosis to remember an alien coming in the bedroom when she was a child. This might have been Daryl Sims's work, and had sprayed some agent inside the nasal cavity, after which the implants were removed. Now, in particular, Daryl Sims, and I've seen other investigators talk about this, one or more of the implants have been analyzed, and I don't know if they've carefully analyze the interior as well as the exterior in terms of finding out what the composition is and trying to document any internal structure. But clearly, these devices have been analyzed by scientists in a limited number of cases, and they have some very interesting electromagnetic properties. And what I point out in the book is that it's almost as if these properties predicted the type of materials that would be developed by human scientists 20 or 30 years later, that the human scientists would work in developing with the same type of metals, but with unusual, we call them metamaterials. They have unusual physical properties, in this case, electromagnetic properties that were already characteristic of the implants that have been removed from abductees maybe 20 years prior to that. So it's very interesting. No one has been able to show a function for the implants that have been studied by scientists, by human scientists, or been able to demonstrate that there is some type of mechanical function, or it could function as a brain-computer interface. But the fact that these devices or components of the devices that have been studied have such interesting electromagnetic properties makes me speculate that they may be part of a brain-computer interface, and we just don't have the whole device. And if we did, we'd be able to, working with engineers and neurobiologists, be able to show that it does in fact and function as like some of the devices that Elon Musk is working with, the Neuralink. But we don't have that information yet. That data, that evidence.
Right. Someone in the audience is asking, physiologically, is there an advantage to the placement of a nasal implant for the kind of interfacing that you're talking about?
Well, it's maybe safer because the devices may have components called squids, and I talk about this in the book, that can detect very, very minute magnetic signals from the brain, a billionth or a trillionth or even less of a Tesla, so that and these magnetic signals from the brain are very, very weak. But there may be a possibility having an implant in the nasal cavity of detecting these signals, so that it would obviate the need for having to have the implant inside the brain, where it could have effects on nerve function, vascular function that could have adverse outcomes. I don't have. I have only limited knowledge of evidence that these implants are inside the brain, but there are some abductees that have unusual images obtained from neuroimages from CT scan or MRIs, indicating, and they have abduction experiences that have been documented by regressive hypnosis, have these strange objects that show up on these CT scans or MRI scans that we think may be alien implants. But again, that evidence is limited, that in fact, we can prove that the implants are inside the brain instead of the nasal cavity. But if I remember one abductee that has her CT scan, but again refuses to have any consideration of having the implant removed. I sympathize with her. Of course, it's a very involved, invasive procedure. But I'm confident that in a few years or decades, humans would have the technology to be able to again eavesdrop on human cognition and perception, with an implant that would be placed not in the brain, inside the brain, but in a nasal cavity. The technology is there to, envision, just by simple extrapolation, that we'd be able to do this in some limited period of time.
Right. So as we're talking about, and the hour went so fast, but there's one more thing I'd like to cover. We're talking about the trope or the framework of the classic alien abduction scenario. Part of that is multi-generational, that this happens to families. Same thing as with psi phenomenon, all of that kind of stuff. So you you looked into your grandfather's passing and made some compelling discoveries or hypotheses. Can you talk about that a little?
I could never figure out, even at a young age, when I heard that my grandfather died at the age of 42 of cavernous sinus thrombosis. He had in one of the nasal cavities, um, actually one of the sinuses. It was actually not an air sinus, but a blood sinus called the uh, cavernous sinus. A blood clot that became infected and spread to his brain caused him meningitis. I never, even before I was considering that I was an abductee, even before there were any books written about alien abduction, I never believed this. It just seemed to be such a strange, quirky, rare type of of, of medical problem to have that could take your life. And in doing research for the book from the book, I discovered it's extremely rare. At the time my grandfather passed away in 1932, there might have been 5 or 6 other people in the country that had this problem. And how coincidental is it that this particular blood sinus is adjacent to the air sinus called the sphenoid sinus that is a surgical route for pituitary resections or surgical resections that human neurosurgeons do to remove tumors from the pituitary. So this is very commonly used. And actually this is the root of spread of infections that call meningitis is right from the sphenoid sinus, which is the air sinus used for the surgery, pituitary surgery. And it goes directly to the cavernous sinus and then spreads to the meninges of the brain. And this happens very commonly in these pituitary resections that you get a meningitis. And in looking at the incidence of this, it was much, much more common that an infection would be caused by a surgical intervention than an uncomplicated sinus infection, which, as I said, was only 1 in 19 million. The incidence was only 1 in 19 million at the time my grandfather died. And through a lot of research and discussion in the book, I present the theory with a lot of supportive evidence that it's much more likely, 100 or 500 times more likely that my grandfather died of some type of unknown surgical intervention, and then he died of cavernous sinus or uncomplicated cavernous sinus thrombosis. So if I'm convinced I was an abductee, and the aliens have been shown historically to be interested in bloodlines, it's not too much of a stretch to say may also have had one of these implantation procedures that went badly during the age that preceded the age of antibiotics. So if he did have an infection, there was nothing a human doctor could do to save his life when he developed the meningitis. And the chapter presents a lot of medical evidence to support this theory that I think would be interesting and for those that don't have a medical or scientific background to kind of to look at, and it makes, again, raises the question of how sinister a program this is if it not only causes chronic sinusitis and other medical effects in the abductee, but also could conceivably have dramatic effects and perhaps even take the abductee's life. And we don't know whether this has happened with other abductees or in the family of preceding generations in abductee families that we don't even know about.
Right.
But I theorize that it did happen in my family.
Right. And I think that's the last question of the evening. And you can be general because some of my guests have gotten into trouble for talking too specifically. Have other members of your family come forward or told you things in private about their own experiences as you've gone on this journey more and more?
I've usually say no, but in
Okay.
thinking more about some of the memories I've had, I have to bring up my father had chronic sinus headaches, sinusitis, with no medical cause. You know, I I always wonder why my mother, from the very young age, was so, even though she didn't attend college, was so interested in astronomy, read as many books about UFOs as you did. What was the reason for her interest? I had one memory of her coming to tell me that she had, and she wasn't sure if it was a dream. She thought she was awake at the time, of having hands behind her that did not feel human, that were touching her head, had a leathery, clammy feel to them. And I also talk in the book about an experience I had with a gray, where I had also the experience of having the hands of a gray near or touching my head, or probably the back of my head, which would tend to make me speculate that my mother might have been involved. But again, that's one. I have limited anecdotes that would cause me to speculate that she was, again, part of this abduction program. But I've already talked
Right.
about my grandfather and the fact that my father, seemed. I don't want to really tie myself to this, but he seemed to be
Mhm.
aware that something strange was going on in our family, that something he knew I was experiencing, something he might have experienced, because he warned me that if I ever need to um, flee to a safe room, as it
Right.
were. I don't know why I would have had to. That he pointed out there was a special door that he had installed leading up to the attic. So I don't have specific things, but the I guess the most striking connection would be between my experiences and what I believe what uh, what experiences my grandfather had that led
Right.
ultimately to his demise.
Right. Thank you for sharing that. I will just say, and I know we're we're out of time. I never had any interest in the UFO phenomenon, abductee, contactee, even after Tanya and I had our experience in 2009, because we had 2.25 hours of missing time that we could not account for. And it wasn't until, I believe it was Dave Schrader, you and I talked about, both being interviewed by Dave Schrader. I think he said, while we were on with him, have you ever been regressed? And we had been surrounded by very impressive people in the field for over a decade, and no one had ever suggested it to us before. We were well aware of Bud Hopkins and Barbara Lamb, all these different people,
Mhm.
John Mack and all. So we underwent it. Well, a year prior to that, I got absolutely obsessive and began to look at all of the marquee cases. And I think that was for me to have context, which is so important to me
Mhm.
to comprehend the world. Um, to have that context to look at the experience and go, oh yeah, that was part of that case, and that was part of that case, and that is a recurring thing. So it could be that your mom's compulsion, it could have predated, it could have been at the same time, we don't know, but this compulsion to make sense of, to provide context for it, which alleviates some frisson, some dissonance in us, to at
Yeah,
least try to understand. Yeah.
that makes sense. That makes sense, and it might have started, you know, because of experiences she had in her family. It might have been intensified when she realized something strange was happening to me when I was a child.
Yeah.
And but you know, I think it. We all wonder if whether or not we're alone, and we have experiences that tend to to raise that possibility that we're not alone. We 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 look for answers, and we we look to whatever primary sources of, whether it's astronomy or alien abduction research. We're trying to explain what we think might have happened to us, even if we have a dim uh, sense of exactly what transpired. That can, in many cases, can only be uncovered by regressive hypnosis. In my case, everything I report in the book was consciously recalled. I've never had hypnosis, and yet, because these experiences made such a profound impression on me, I committed myself to remembering as much as I could my entire life.
Yeah. So what's next on your quest for you?
Well, I'm I'm starting to get involved with these UFO study groups that are made up of abductees and scientists. And, you know, one group in particular is an international group. And frankly, I've always been fascinated, focusing so much on what's been happening, in America. I wondered if people in other countries have experiences that are very similar to the quote unquote American stereotypical alien abduction experiences. I'm starting to get into contacts and work with these international groups where I can find out, you know, when they say this is a worldwide phenomenon, is it really in fact the same phenomenon we're talking about, which would be, as a scientist, you're always trying to replicate what people would experimental data in a laboratory in one part of the planet, and show that keeping the experiment controlled in the same way that you can get the same results in a different laboratory anywhere in the world. And so that's very exciting to me, to be able to see if in fact what investigators have been saying for so long is true. In fact, we're not the Americans are not the only ones that are being experimented on by the same group of advanced alien beings. So
Right.
that's something I find fascinating. As a going forward in terms of the research I've done for the past 2 or 3 years in writing the book.
Yeah.
Looking
Is there
forward very
another
much
book
to it.
coming?
Maybe from those
Right. From those experiences.
collaborative research
Right.
experiences, starting with some one or more international groups. You know, I don't want to keep saying this, but I think in some cases regressive hypnosis can be helpful. In other cases, can be counterproductive. But I'm still contemplating whether or not, in my case, it can lead to uncovering any of the buried parts of the many experiences I've had that might be subject for another book. But again, it's something I'm a little bit leery of it at this point in time. But I know it with a lot of people, they were able to recall only through hypnosis what they experienced in terms of the abduction context.
Mm.
Other people have mentioned they tried hypnosis and it had no effect at all. They weren't able to retrieve any of the memories. So it's to some degree a mixed bag at this point, especially since there's so much in the popular culture already in terms of not just books, but television shows and movies, and which is kind of a contaminating influence. So
Right.
but it's something I'm considering.
Yep. Excellent. Well, I want to thank you for your time. You graciously stayed a little longer than we had agreed. I appreciate that. And all best to you, sir. Thank you.
Uh, Joey, was a great experience. I knew it would be because I've been following um, your podcast, and I really enjoyed it, and I will be continuing to see what you're doing in terms of the guests you're having on in the future, because we all need to share what we know, and each of us has, I think, a tiny piece of the puzzle. That's when
Absolutely.
it's
Yeah.
crucial to communicate. I just hope that more scientists would be part of that.
I know the scientists that are out there. You need to get on board with this. So thank you, sir. Have a wonderful evening, and let's please stay in touch.
Definitely, I certainly will. Thanks so much.
All right, folks, that was awesome. The hour just flew by. We didn't get to everything, but I really wanted you to hear Bruce's experiences. There's an afterword in here where he does a detailed assessment of the Walter Reed autopsy report that Lieutenant Colonel Philip J. Corso had helped to facilitate, and a really compelling thesis about what these grays are, how they work, and how things like the traveling over distance and through wormholes and absorption of nutrients and the physiology. It's fascinating stuff. I'm very grateful for all of you. Here we are at 206 episodes. The next 3 episodes, we're going to continue to build on this in some interesting ways. We're going to do Agenda 30 on Sinister Mysteries next week. And Craig and I are going to look at that. And of course, that is the leading edge of this AI work that Dr. Rapuano talked about, the neural link and all that, and leading, of course, into transhumanism, which will be in 3 weeks. Nested in the middle of that, the sandwich, if you will, we're going to have Gen Gooseward on. He's going to talk about the Atrahasis Epsic. He's going to talk about the Enuma Elish. I'm going to ask him, because I just read it courtesy of Wallace Wagner. I just reread the Epic of Gilgamesh. And the idea that these were off-planet, mistaken as gods, but advanced races with very, very high biotech. And other kinds of tech, early AI, matrixy kind of stuff. So thank you all. Thanks for staying with me tonight. I'll see you all soon. Be safe. God bless.